Hello. Oh, it does amplify my voice. You said it was not going to amplify my voice. So my name is Rob Duff. I am the COO for Coherent Solutions. Welcome, and thanks to everyone for coming today. We had wanted to have Igor Epstein, our CEO, give some opening remarks, but unfortunately, Igor's sick. So he has the stomach flu. I don't know if he got the bad romaine from Yuma or what the deal is, but he's down. So I'll kick things off. We're really excited about our topic, blockchain, just to make sure you're in the right room, not like supposed to be at the sales conference or something. Over the last 20, 30 years, there have been a lot of innovations in technology, web, cloud, mobile. Blockchain is sort of the next in that lineage that really has the promise of changing how a lot of business is done, how society works, and has some exciting possibilities that we want to talk about here. We're excited about you as an audience. You guys are pretty cool. I don't know if you know that. We have a lot of great technology leaders, business leaders, some entrepreneurs. So it'd be exciting to see the conversation that comes out of that. Before we get into the program, I just wanted to speak briefly about Coherent Solutions. So Coherent Solutions is a software product development and consulting company. The company was founded by Igor Epstein about 20 years ago, 1995. We are proud to have over 800 consultants now working for a variety of different companies, all shapes and sizes, geographies, industries, and we help them deliver on their innovation and deliver on software solutions. We have an excellent set of panelists today here. Get them in the middle of their bites. They have to eat quickly while I talk, and Max is going to talk a little bit, and then we'll get to them. But just so you know who we have up here, we have from left to right, we have David Schweitz from the U.S. Federal Reserve. We have Varsha Bhatia from PeerNova, Chris Swanson from U.S. Bank, and Dave Checky from Cargill. And we'll let them talk a little bit more here in a moment. So we have two objectives today. One is to convey information about blockchain in a variety of different areas. So we want to talk about the technology itself, what makes it interesting, what makes it different from a technical perspective compared to other data management platforms. The second thing we want to talk about is some business cases, use cases, where can it be applied in industry. And then the third is to give you some sense from a practical standpoint, if you wanted to kick off a blockchain initiative, how would you start? Where would you start? So conveying information is one piece of this. But the second thing we want to do is start a conversation. So the blockchain is still relatively immature, as you'll see, and as I'm sure our panelists will share. So the story of blockchain is not fully written yet. We at Coherent want to be part of writing that story, as I'm sure a number of you want to be for your respective organizations. So we want to begin the conversation. And I guess I'd encourage you, great networking beforehand. We'll do the formal event, some Q&A, but then we have the room for a while afterwards, so please continue the networking afterwards. Please feel free to talk with our panelists afterward, exchange contact information, because that's another big, important outcome of this event is to get you all talking and help move blockchain forward in general and maybe in Minneapolis in particular. So blockchain can be somewhat complicated technology, and we'll try not to get too much into the weeds as we go through things here, but we thought it would be useful to start with somewhat of a working definition of blockchain. So to that end, I'd like to introduce Max Belov, who's our CTO. Max is going to come up and do kind of a blockchain 101, blockchain primer. We'll see how much 101 it is versus graduate seminar. So go for it, Max.
Thank you, Rob. So if you'll excuse me, I'll use my little cheat sheet here because otherwise, like Rob said, we'll be here for 3 hours and the panelists would not get a chance to talk about anything because we'll be deep in the weeds of the technology. But as Rob said, kind of blockchain continues the lineage from some of the other disrupting technologies that we've seen over the last few decades. And just like with anything else, blockchain is not necessarily anything new. The work on the technology started in the early 90s, and some of the underpinnings that made the technology possible have been around for quite a bit longer. It became more widely known really after the white paper was published in 2008, and then its first implementation in the form of Bitcoin cryptocurrency in 2009. And ever since, for many people, it's become kind of synonymous with financial industry and with cryptocurrencies in particular. And those use cases are still prevalent, and we have a couple of our panelists here out of that kind of industry. But the use of the technology has expanded well beyond that and across really multiple industries. So you may ask yourself, what's so special about it? Why are we talking about it today? Well, it's the promise that it brings. It's really the level of transparency and trust that the technology makes possible, achieving so efficiently that was not really possible before, unless you introduce multiple intermediaries in your business process or implement a long process of reconciling the data among multiple participants. It essentially kind of helps ensure that all the participants in your business process work with the same data, with the same information, and are in agreement on what it is. From a technical perspective, blockchain is really a data management, distributed data management platform. It enables you to securely store data, and it enables you to validate authenticity of the data that you store. It ensures, like I said, that all the participants in your business process look at the same data. And it also allows you to associate business rules with the data that you have so that you can automate the process of defining and enforcing your business process. The realization of the technology itself is based on something called distributed ledger technology, or DLT for short. That's really, I mean, ledgers have been around for quite a while, and we all know what that is. A distributed ledger technology provides the data model that allows you to define the kind of the state of your digital records. It defines a transactional language that describes how the data gets changed, and it also defines the protocol for adding new transactions to your data store. In a blockchain, data is stored, as you can derive from the name, as a sequence of blocks. Each block contains one or more of your data transactions. It contains a trusted timestamp so that the data is serialized. And most importantly, each block in the chain is linked to the previous block via something called cryptographic hash, or a digital fingerprint of that data block. And this ensures that once committed to a blockchain, the data is tamper-proof, that it cannot be updated or deleted, or if it has been updated or deleted, it gives the participants a way to verify that the data has been tampered with. The next important component of the blockchain technology is called consensus algorithm. So it's essentially the protocol that defines how these new blocks are added to a blockchain in such a way that all of the participants of the network have the same opinion, can come to an agreement as to what the actual current state of the data is. It kind of ensures that, like I said, that everybody has the same information, but it also prevents malicious actors who may be potentially part of the network from manipulating data to their own advantage. And then the last key component of the technology, and it's really the one that has expanded its application, are smart contracts. Smart contracts are really just applications represented by computer code that lives on your blockchain just like any other data element. So it's secured in the same manner, it can be verified in the same manner, and it gets executed on network nodes whenever certain conditions are met. And those conditions are really part of the definition of your smart contract as well. You know, there are different implementations of, depending on how your blockchain is implemented, you may need to use specialized programming tools to define those smart contracts, but with some platforms and frameworks, you also have the ability to use general purpose languages like JavaScript or C++ or Go to implement your smart contracts. So if I really wanted to sum it up in a single sentence, you can think of blockchain defined simply as a distributed immutable ledger with smart contracts. And I'll leave you guys with that simple definition, and I'm sure our panelists will be able to expand on that quite a bit over the next hour or so.
Thank you. So maybe before we go on, this is for the benefit of the panelists, I just want to do a brief survey, show of hands, just so we have a sense of the level of knowledge people have of blockchain. So maybe first level, hopefully this is not anyone, like you know literally nothing about blockchain. First time you ever heard the term? Oh, one. Sarah, you're so brave. She's being modest. So number two is you've heard about blockchain, never used it, have some knowledge of it, but never gotten your hands dirty. That's probably the majority, lots and lots of people. Okay. Third, you've actually used blockchain in some way, actually gotten your hands dirty from a technical perspective. Oh, look at some. Does anybody have anything in production that they're using? Right, yes. Them too. Well, maybe not Varsha, but okay. That's useful, I think. Just that's what I kind of assumed would be the crowd, but it's useful to know. So I wanted to let the panelists, before we get into the actual conversation, let the panelists just introduce themselves, their role in their companies, and then talk briefly about how they're using blockchain, just so you have a perspective of where each one of them are coming from when they come to the conversation. So, Dave, first.
Do I got to turn anything on? Is it working? All right. Can you hear me? No? Yes? Yes? Okay. I'm David Schweitz from the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis. I run the technology organization there, as well as infosecurity. I'll give a couple examples of what we're doing with blockchain, both inside and outside the organization. I'm involved with a few things outside the organization as well. And just to be clear, my comments are my own, my opinions are my own. So if I say something, I'm not, don't imply that, don't infer, I should say, that I am setting the direction for the economic stability of the U.S. in any means whatsoever. And you can cut all my comments. But anyway, so a few examples. We're gonna, we have one group I'm working with has a digital ledger, distributed ledger technology that they're working on. Not blockchain backed, but it really is around testing the transactions between digital wallets. So it's much more wallet focused. Another couple organizations have built some prototypes on Ethereum as well as Hyperledger. On the Ethereum side, the goal of this organization is really interesting. They really want to have a digital currency that they can go down to their company convenience store and actually do a purchase and have sort of an internal currency, if you will. That's going forward. Specifically in the Fed, we've got a couple of organizations. I don't know how much you know about the Fed, but we've got a group called the Payment Standard Outreach Group. And of course, like everyone, we have acronyms. PSOG. At the Fed, we usually put the word Fed in front of everything, but the acronym PSOG just didn't go over well, so we just call it PSOG. But it's really about standards, so we work with a couple different bodies. If any of you have heard of X9, it's a national standards body. We have got work going on there just to standardize just blockchain terminology. And it's interesting because we work with, be on calls with like some of the world's like best digital cryptographers, and the discussions and the depth of the conversations you get just to talk about common terminology. It's fascinating to me. I mean, we talk for hours with some of these people. So that one's just to figure out like an encyclopedia or a dictionary of common blockchain terminology. Then there's the International Standards Organization, ISO, that we work with. A couple things there that we're working on is to have sort of a catalog of the non-fiat digital currencies around the world. And we have that today for normal fiat currencies. There's codes for every currency in the world. But now we're trying to do this for digital non-fiat currencies. And that's fascinating because it feels like they're changing every day. Like there's new ones popping up, and I don't even think we have them all. And then another piece of the ISO that we're working on is just really infrastructure assessment around just the security risks around digital wallets and what standards would help sort of shore up these securities. So a lot of things from the physical implementation to sort of the standards work, which isn't that exciting for some people, but we kind of run the realm.
Hi. So my name is Varsha Bhatia. I'm a product manager with a startup called PeerNova. We are about a 4-year-old company and located in the heart of Silicon Valley. We are a blockchain platform, and more specifically, we build applications for financial institutions. In one sentence, I would say, again, we build a platform for storing, securing, and validating data. But we've come at it a little differently. When we started out building out this platform, we realized that the default distributed, the technology that was built for Bitcoin implementation, the default distributed technology, distributed platform technology could not be applied directly to some of the core problems in the financial industry that we were trying to solve. And when I say core problems, these are problems around workflow automation and exception management processing, risk validation, reconciliation, audit and compliance challenges, cybersecurity requirements, right? All of these problems. So you can't just take the technology as it was set for the Bitcoin implementation and apply it directly to some of these core problems. While we find a lot of the facets and characteristics of the Bitcoin blockchain very interesting, we've taken only the ones that are relevant to solving some of these core problems. And then we've bundled it up with open source, industry standard, big data platforms to solve problems of volume and velocity and transactions of scale, which these financial institutions face. And then also integrate with some of the cloud technologies that are available out there that these financial institutions are already using. And we've kind of built our entire stack on top of that. And as we go through this panel discussion, I'll talk a little bit more about how we're using the blockchain model itself within our technology.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Swanson. I work for a U.S. bank and I lead our blockchain and distributed ledger practice. Throughout the course of today's discussion, I'll be using blockchain and distributed ledger pretty interchangeably. They mean slightly different things, but just work with me here. We'll keep the language pretty simple. So I've been working in the space for about the last 3.5 years. Our mandate in the organization is to look at emerging technology and changing consumer business behavior and understand where those things intersect with financial services. So literally 3.5 years ago, our chief innovation officer came over and said, hey, start looking into Bitcoin. And since then, it's turned into this really amazing thing. So we define the technology in sort of layman's terms as a mechanism wherein a group of people or entities that don't entirely trust each other to agree upon a set of facts and then agree on how those facts will change over time. And so the one that I think has been mentioned a few times now is Bitcoin. And in the Bitcoin network, the fact that is being tracked is an unspent transaction output, or a UTXO, and that is the Bitcoin. That is ownership of the Bitcoin itself. And so that's the fact on the Bitcoin network, and the way that that fact is tracked over time is through the blockchain and the Bitcoin protocol. So full transparency, everyone can see everything that's happening on the network. Therefore, everyone can validate that a transaction that took place was allowed to take place based on the rules of the network. And as was said, that's fascinating. It's a fascinating implementation of existing technology that solved a problem, namely allowing people to exchange value without having a central intermediary. So there's no bank, there's no payment network, there's no escrow service that sits in the middle of that transaction. There isn't an entity called Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just a group of people who have all agreed to run the same set of software. And that's interesting, but again, doesn't play very well in a heavily regulated financial service or financial industry. And so our thought, and we weren't alone here, is that could you apply the same principles of technology, namely tracking that set of facts with people that don't trust each other, to traditional financial assets? And so that's what we've spent the bulk of the last 3 years doing, is trying to understand, are there asset classes within the financial services industry or problems within the financial services industry where there isn't necessarily an entity that mediates transactions, that doesn't provide a golden source of the truth? And so you look at things like loan syndications, large loans where multiple banks are all participating in the same loan. In those sorts of instances, the banks are reconciling directly with each other. It's incredibly inefficient. It's incredibly expensive. International payments, the same thing applies there. There isn't an entity that mediates those transactions. The banks are reconciling against each other. And so you look at problems like that, and they say this is a place where if you insert a thin layer over the top that allows both parties or all parties to see the same set of data, the same set of facts, and mandate the way in which those facts will change over time, the consensus mechanism, the distributed ledger really provides an awful lot of interesting applications. And so we're at a point right now where we've done quite a bit of prototyping, demonstrated some really nice value. And so we, along with, it sounds like everyone else, are sort of in the last mile toward actual implementation of production systems.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Checky. I work at Cargill. Cargill is a family-owned farming business. Very wealthy family-owned farming business. We're one of the largest private companies in the world, 150 years old, and comprehensively cover the entire agricultural supply chain from grain origination all the way to food ingredients and meat and those types of products. So I work in a group called Digital Labs, Cargill Digital Labs, where we do tech R&D and innovation, digital product innovation and so forth. One of the things we're looking very closely at is blockchain. Unlike a lot of the, maybe not necessarily entirely unlike the rest of the panelists, Cargill is not looking with any true sincerity right now at crypto, like cryptocurrencies, like financial stuff. We actually actively coach people away from those use cases, coin-based solutions, Bitcoin code, forking Bitcoin or whatever, like all that stuff is on our run fast away from list on the decision trees. And instead, what we're focused on, first and foremost, is enterprise use cases and really just disintermediating trust in existing business processes. So how can we transact? How can we work with our partners? How can we provide better data solutions to the market in open, transparent, and trusted ways? So we're doing a couple different things. The first is, as somebody pointed out, several people have pointed out, the technology is incredibly immature. And so we're actively investing engineering time in maturing the technology. So core fundamentals, writing software that helps get blockchain to a place where it's more ready to be used by enterprises. That effort is focused entirely right now in Hyperledger, which is a Linux Foundation open source project portfolio. I forget what Linux Foundation calls that. I think they call it a project, and then within that they have sub-projects or something. But so we actively write software and push that back up for that to be used. And then the other dimension is then we try to seek use cases for stuff. And so an agricultural supply chain type company, we look at a few different primary use cases. Track and trace is obviously one, so like keeping track of where stuff came from and the attributes and data about that across the entire supply chain from a farm all the way to a grocery store where we buy a product, for example. We also do, in an old farming business that's not always very regulated or hasn't historically been super regulated, there's an incredible amount of just social understanding and almost weird implicit trust between trading partners. And so, which is fascinating, super fascinating. Like, of course I'll pay you for that. Like, why wouldn't I pay you for that? Like, we don't need to write anything down, right? No, now we need to write stuff down. So we're looking at, like, how do we apply things like smart contracts or other types of contractual agreements with our trading partners in that sense, and maturing that across the spectrum of both like traditional other ag trading partners, but also farmers and upstream and downstream participants in the supply chain. So that's pretty much what it is. Honestly, we also spend a ton of time, just to be clear, explaining to people at Cargill, rule one is you don't need a blockchain. I don't care what your problem is. Yeah. And we spend a whole lot of time educating people on what it is. So like these 101 type sessions are things we do a lot. People heard about Bitcoin at Thanksgiving or at Christmas, and then they come back to work and say, like, right now we need to do this no matter what it is. And so we do a lot of just like education and awareness development in the business. But we are doing also sincere stuff too, so trying to pursue both sides of that.
So you guys threw out
just talked about, I think, is what triggered Ethereum to implement what they call a gas limit. So that means the piece of code on the smart contract, when that executes, it can only be so complex. These are specifically built to sort of be simple processes, and not, you think about a distributed environment, how the horsepower processing that could take up on a certain computing power. So they limit, again, it's called the gas limit, where if it's too complex, it won't even run. But smart contracts are a good example of the differences between the different blockchain implementations. Not all of them have it. Ethereum that sort of was their, sort of their bread and butter to the marketplace. The block the Bitcoin one does not have smart contracts attached to it. Others don't as well. The example that I always use, a simple one, is it's a little bit more interesting than banking. It's insurance. But if you like get in a car accident, if there's a blockchain implementation, when you make that phone call, the smart contract can kick off to initiate the claims process. Now, you could do that in a generic database environment today with stored procedures and things like that, but the inherent usage and immutability of the blockchain allows that to happen more efficiently and easier.
So you had mentioned, I think David mentioned before, just some areas of pushback when you're trying to roll it out around privacy or privacy concerns. What are other areas that you've seen in terms of pushback from stakeholders around the technology?
I can go.
Please.
So again, so I think there are three that we've seen. One is what we call the consortium or network effect, right? So if you think about problems around issuance, settlement, and clearing of assets or funds or whatever, if these are all multi-party problems, right? If JP Morgan wants to work with HSBC or wants to work with Goldman Sachs, and if you're talking about adopting a new technology, JP Morgan is going to say, I'll implement it only if Goldman Sachs implements it. So basically, there are multiple parties that need to come on board before the technology can be adopted. The second thing that we've seen is it's an immature platform. It doesn't meet the current requirements of scalability, performance, and usability. The third thing we've seen is support for legacy infrastructure, right? So these organizations have 30 to 40 years of code sitting in their organization, and then they've written 5 more years of layers of code to keep up with newer technologies. They're not going to just overhaul all of this legacy technology and bundle them up into smart contracts, right? Whatever platform is needed to be used, it's not necessarily for greenfield applications, which is great with smart contracts. So those are the 3 kinds of things that I think limit mainstream adoption.
I think the one that I have that I'll bring, and I'm going to pick on Chris again. And the only reason I'm picking on him so much is because we at the Federal Reserve examine U.S. banks. So we got to keep an eye on him.
I just sit here with my mouth shut. Yes, yes.
But if you think about, I think he brought this up earlier, some of the untrusted, anonymous implementations of blockchain really wouldn't work very well for his use case for things like AML, anti-money laundering, that you have to do in his industry. Like, that would be a bad starter for him to build a solution on that type of blockchain. So that's another simple one that I wanted to throw out there.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly, I hope, that one of the major issues that I think that we face today is there isn't a good framework by which we can choose which platform to build on, because there isn't really anything in operation yet that we can use as an analog or to say this system does this really well, this system does something else really well. And the thing that you want to avoid is 15 years down the road when blockchain is operating at full speed and we now have 25 different blockchain platforms, none of which speak to each other. That basically just, today we have an issue where Bank 1 has a core system, Bank 2 has a core system, and you have to reconcile against them. That's an arduous process. All we would be doing if we end up with 25 blockchain solutions that don't speak to each other is Bank 1 will be using one solution, Bank 2 will be using another solution, and they'll have to reconcile against each other, and it's still an arduous process. We've just elevated it one step there. So figuring out some rationale about how all these things are going to play together, I think lends some caution when we're looking at what is possibly going to be many different systems applied to different use cases.
So the interesting part about that comment is there's companies, and Varsha probably knows this being in Silicon Valley, but there's companies that are getting started up just to be integrators between the different types of blockchains. So I think there's one between Ethereum and Bitcoin, I think, is just a company just to integrate the two. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out over time.
So so in terms of moving forward, I mean, Chris kind of started down the path. So what advice would you give for one to start in the area if they're new? How do you get going? Actually, maybe let me ask a couple other questions first. So Bitcoin is something one participates in, right? you're not going to create your own Bitcoin implementation, probably, right? Is it possible? Can one write data to the blockchain, the Bitcoin blockchain, that's not Bitcoin transactions? Can you use it just as a
Start?
Yeah,
I'll say
please.
a couple things. So it's really funny. I have my kids sort of to educate them. We're mining Bitcoin at home, and we've got a small GPU that I think we calculated it'll be a year and a half before we'll get a fraction of a Bitcoin, and the amount of electricity that we'll spend by that time won't even pay for it for a week or something. It takes a long time, but things, that's sort of how I got them started. Again, like the CryptoKitties thing, like just trying to find technology that you can use it. You can download, and Coinbase has a wallet you can get. You can actually go to some sites and use virtual currencies now and actually buy things if you just want to experiment usage of it. If you want to go deeper, the things that sort of we're doing at the Fed, a lot of the cloud, major cloud providers, AWS, Amazon just rolled out their, I think announced theirs last week, but Microsoft's Azure, pronounced different ways, they have a whole framework based on Ethereum that you can actually, they have templates you can build solutions if you want to get your hands into the weeds. But depending on what level you want to get into.
Yeah, so the way that I got into it was just reading as much as I possibly could. And I think one of the fascinating things about an emergent technology that has an enormous amount of hype associated with it that nobody understands is everyone justifies their existence by writing a white paper, right? And that's true for McKinsey, and it's true for startups, and it's true for technology companies, and it's true for banks and any other company that's operating in the space. And they're all free because everyone is trying to assert their knowledge of the space by getting it out into as wide a field as possible. And so I think a really good way to just, spend some casual reading time is to just read, probably starting with like the IBMs and the McKinseys, those ones that are sort of written from a more business-oriented perspective, to understand some of the principles behind the technology. And then, read the Bitcoin white paper because that's sort of the seminal work in the space. Read the Ethereum white paper because I think that provides a good contrast to the objectives of what Ethereum is trying to do relative to Bitcoin. And then if you really want to go crazy, like start diving into the white papers that some of these startups that issued ICOs or initial coin offerings did, because they are looking at very specific use cases within the space, some of which are really interesting, some of which are insane, but they raised an enormous amount of money doing these sorts of things, like $250 million in some cases. And then if you really want to just head straight down the rabbit hole, go to Reddit. That's where I spend a lot of time just reading about what is the most cutting-edge, insane thing that's happening in the space. So there's different degrees about how far you want to head into it, but there is so much information that's completely free that you can educate yourself pretty soundly with this.
I had done to prepare for this. I got on the Reddit subthread.
Nice.
That was
Yeah.
very helpful.
Nice, yeah.
I got confused very quickly.
Yeah.
Good. So then I'll apply maybe that's awesome stuff, but there's certainly people at Cargill that geek out on Reddit. The guy behind me spends a lot of time on that. But like when we're doing just practical, how do I get up to speed on stuff? Like we never talk Bitcoin, first of all, and like I like the idea. We've actually debated like should we tell people to go buy a Bitcoin or some, maybe not a whole one, but a fractional amount, just to like get familiar with it. But instead, what we do is we hand out legal pads and we play tic-tac-toe with everyone keeping their own copy of the ledger. And we talk about how transactions get distributed to a ledger of just a game of tic-tac-toe. And that's a real thing. Sawtooth, Hyperledger Sawtooth actually supports, there's a XO, it's called XO, because not everybody around the globe refers to it as tic-tac-toe. But then we can actually do it. And so like we've done that with other big agricultural companies. Like, don't anybody worry about any data. All we're going to do is play tic-tac-toe, and you're going to have a copy of the ledger, and we're going to have a copy. And then you can go show your management and leadership like what's really going on here. Like how we can all keep the game state, and we can all agree on what the state of the game is. And then like how that game can change. And like, look, no one could hack this because we'd see these other things. And so even just having that hands-on, like now I get what a ledger is. I can see where in the financial industries, like people understand these concepts a whole lot. But in ag, in particular, like in the supply chain space, it's not always obvious. Like it's a distributed ledger and it's immutable. And like what the hell does that even mean, right? So like let's play tic-tac-toe and show you what it means. And so that's actually been pretty effective for us. Yeah.
The other two things I'd add is, look for local meetups. That's big, just to network with people and just find out what others are doing in the area. And also, irrespective of the space that you're in, if you're attending any of the big conferences around even like big data or security, they always have some sessions around how they're using blockchain. Look out for those sessions so you know how it's being integrated with some of the other systems as well.
There's a meet in Minneapolis, so I don't know. Like, there's a meetup that's specifically focused on enterprise use cases, where they actively try to say, like, we're not here to talk about Bitcoin. Now, everyone who shows up is like trying to sneak Bitcoin into their presentation. Like some crypto fascist will like wave a flag in the middle of a thing, and disrupt it. But like, that's the intention is very much for it to be enterprise driven from a use case, and so it's actually pretty worthwhile.
So we had talked obviously a lot about financial use cases, supply chain use cases. What are other use cases not named financial services industry or supply chain? I mean, I've heard people talk about identity management. I don't know. I guess there's asset management in general. What just sparked people's imaginations? Where else can they use it?
So, and I'll try and stay pretty grounded here because it's a pretty big idea. This whole notion of self-sovereign identity. So if you look at Facebook's business model today is for you to log on and provide all of the information in the world, and then Facebook turns around and aggregates that data and applies AI to it, and they make a fortune off of it. Self-sovereign identity is the idea that you should be able to own your own data. And so if you think of the supply chain stuff that has been discussed and just apply it to data that you produce, is there a way that you can maintain ownership of that data and then choose to sell that data to companies that you want to have your data and receive some compensation for it? That's interesting. If you look at Facebook, it becomes particularly compelling 10 years down the road. If today the average person in the US has 2 or 3 connected devices, in 10 years maybe you've got 500 connected devices. If we orient ourselves with today's sort of technology set and apply it out 10 years, you are now providing 10 to 100 orders of magnitude more data than you are today that's going to a Facebook, Google, or Amazon, and they are going to make substantially more money off of the data that you're producing. If you can apply a self-sovereign model to it where that data is all going into a database that you own or that you lease out from somebody, and then you can choose who gets that data, you have an opportunity to actually start making money off of all of the data that you're producing. So very sort of aspirational and idealistic, but there are some pretty significant players, not the least of which is Microsoft, who are sort of leading the charge toward the self-sovereign identity framework.
I really like that perspective. I think like outside of the stuff we're doing, but in the abstract, like blockchain is a distributed permissioning network, and like maybe the data lives in other silos, like it continues to, because like putting all of our data in the blockchain feels like a pretty heady concept. But like if my hospital has my hospital records and they have an API for other hospitals to read that, and the permissions for those APIs I manage, and those are distributed on a blockchain, for example, like that feels like a really viable extended use case for blockchain. So like the idea that like we would all be able to manage the permissions of who has the rights or privileges to access our data wherever it sits, as a company, as an individual, as sovereign, that I think that's a really powerful concept.
So adding on to that, there's 1.5 billion people in the world that don't legally have an identity. And the use case I've heard a few weeks ago, adding on to what both of them are saying, is that if there was a centralized identity system that you owned your own identity, it was blockchain. Obviously, this is way into the future. And you think about the permission side of it. Okay, moving from third world country to a bar scenario, but you go into a bar, and an example would be the bartender only needs to know how old you are or when you were born. It doesn't need to know when you were from Minnesota. That's an example where that bartender would get the permission just to see that piece of data. You, as an individual owner of your data, would give that permission to the bartender. And there's some of the other use cases too. There's countries. I think Ghana, Sweden, Honduras are actually using blockchain for their land registry system right now. I believe that's in production or very close to happening.
Great. Okay. So I want to turn it over to you guys. Let you guys ask some questions. What I think I'm going to do. So we're recording it, which is part of why we're using the microphones, because small room. I think you could hear us if we didn't have the microphones.
Except for me, you're not recording me, right?
No, that's right. Yours is dead.
That's good.
So anyway, you guys can ask questions. I'm going to repeat it just so we have it for the video, but it's small enough room. Oh, Chad has a mic apparently. So, so anybody questions? Anyone? Hands. Yeah, go for it.
So this question is probably for Dave and Chris at that. And you both work in organizations that are large, siloed, different business units. And you both, at the beginning, talked about how there's people come to you, they think they need blockchain. They may or may not need blockchain because they don't fully understand it. Is there any commonality in the confusion of people not understanding if and when they need blockchain? Because it certainly seems from the panel that about 80% of the discussion is happening around non-technical people who are trying to figure out if they can use this to their benefit. And I was just wondering, is there any? Have you seen any commonality in the confusion of what some people think blockchain is or is not?
Sure. I think you can kind of split it two ways. There are people who just need help with business process, and there are some potential applications of blockchain in terms of making business process work more smoothly. The problem is what they're really looking for is a workflow application, and while blockchain can help to facilitate workflow more effectively and with more transparency, it isn't a platform, right? PureNova may have something that works in that regard, but if we're looking at generic blockchain technology, workflow isn't really part of it. You have to build a workflow mechanism on top of it. And then I think there are people who have heard about it and want to use it in their business, which is great. I mean, when I run a monthly call that has a few hundred people from the organization on it, where we just talk about news that's happened and some of the work that the bank and others within the industry are working on. And that first call, like 2.5 years ago, was like 5 people and a dog. I mean, it was just dead. It was just me trying to fill up dead air. And so I think the fact that now we're sitting at, 300 to 400 people on it is indicative that there is interest in the space, and that's fantastic. But mostly what we try to do then is to let them down gently and say there isn't really an application here, or there isn't an application here yet. So I think it's people who want to be involved because there's so much hype and excitement around it, which is great. And then it's people who are looking for a problem that blockchain can apply to but doesn't solve in and of itself.
Yeah, in our space, it's probably two big themes. The first is it's not all Bitcoin. And then the second is it's not magic. And so, like a lot of people bring, we'll say stuff like, oh, it's trustable data and da-da-da-da-da. But like it doesn't fix your data. And people could still put data that's not like accurate. Oh, if my supplier puts in 20 kilograms of cocoa beans, then I know it was 20. No, maybe they gave you 25 on the truck. Like that doesn't make it the data magically accurate all the time. And so they're looking for blockchain to solve problems that isn't at all necessarily what it does. And then on the coin side, that's where the market awareness is. Like the casual market awareness in the business leadership, circle is Bitcoin's going crazy. And one of the things we actually try to socialize a lot is like, hey, Bitcoin is very up and down, and like if Bitcoin goes down a whole bunch and the market responds to that, like your teenager is grumpy because his 0.0002 Bitcoin is now worth less or something like that doesn't invalidate the feasibility of blockchain as a technology. And so like does the market's emotions around Bitcoin impact like how enterprises are thinking about use cases? And certainly it does. Like when Bitcoin was raging last winter, like forget it. Like people want it, no matter what it is, we were using blockchain for everything.
Yeah, then people would ask me what's going to happen with Bitcoin's price, and I'm like, if I knew that, I'd be driving around in my Lamborghini and not speaking to you.
They
right
don't
now.
ask us
so,
that. That's
no,
good. That's good. Yeah.
My foresight is clearly not what it needs to be.
Yeah, what about?
Appreciate it. This is definitely helpful. I think what we've been looking at too is it's a tool in the toolbox. You got to find the right tool for the right business problem. How are you guys handling the enterprise internal and maybe even external communication? And more on the banking side, but obviously internal. You referenced that. I think you got a good approach. Are you guys? How are you guys handling trying to fight off some of that hype with reality and helping some folks that are obviously buying into the hype to understand some of those concepts beyond, maybe the obviously the tic-tac-toe game sounds great, but, you go 3 levels up and you're going to have to explain it a different way, right? Or more importantly, externally, the pressures of external, what are you doing? What is U.S. Bank doing about Bitcoin and how you guys are handling that? Sorry, blockchain.
Yeah. And actually, let's start Varsha. I'm going to have you start because you have to talk to these banks and sell them on this, right? So how? Yeah.
Sure, right. So again, the thing about catering to one kind of industry is when we go and talk to them about some of these problems that we've seen other financial institutions that are facing, they can relate to it very quickly and say, yes, we are facing the same problems, right? When you go and talk to them and say, hey, who are the middlemen you are trying to eliminate? It's, they don't want to eliminate themselves, obviously. So what they are trying to eliminate is reducing the cost, the spend in their middle and back office functions. And we try to explain to them why we don't have all of the facets of what blockchain is and why there are only certain things that we've taken which are important for the problems that they're trying to solve, and they can relate to it fairly quickly just because, the kinds of problems are the same. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think internally, we operate our group like a little startup within the organization. So our job is to stay on top of what's happening from a technology and business perspective, sell the heck out of it internally to find customers to work with, and then actually engage in prototype development to sort of demonstrate the value and the viability of the technology. So we try to we try to talk about where it's good. So I've said to a couple people, like, we look for a business unit that has a problem. That's every single business unit in the organization, where the technology is a good solution that eliminates about 95% of them, with a leader that can see more than 6 months beyond the horizon, right? Mm-hmm. Because we need somebody at the SVP or the EVP level to sponsor this, or it's going to die on the vine. Mm-hmm. And so to that end, we sell what we're doing, and then our engagements are 6 to 8 weeks. So we've got a dedicated team of developers that build out solutions. If it's with a bank network, we do that. If it's internally only, we do that as well. But it's about proving it. And then if we've proved it and that the technology does what it has been purported to do, and we hypothesize that it can generate meaningful business value, we'll continue to iterate on it until we've got something that is ultimately ready for a production build. Externally, we're working on blockchain and distributed ledger technology to understand what's happening.
Internally, we follow that exact same process. And the only thing I'd add is that while we're building, especially blockchain stuff, like, we run bi-weekly demos, like sprint reviews, if you will, and just invite anyone in the whole company that wants to come, and then we'll contextualize, like, this is why this is maybe an interesting use case for blockchain. And then if at the end we learn, like, this didn't work, like, this is why this didn't work and stuff. And so those, like, everybody writes a white paper, like, we'll just write a one-pager on, like, this is what the problem was, this is what we tried to solve, this is why we thought blockchain would be good here, and so forth. So that's been helpful in driving that.
Yeah, we're similar in the fact that, the same way the project process works. But the one thing that I try to steer people towards is when you have it's a mix of talking about the technology, educating people. When a business partner comes to me and says, "Hey, I want to use blockchain," I'm like, okay, here's another example of a technology trying to find a business problem to solve. Let's talk about your business problem, mm-hmm. right? You shouldn't be coming to me and say, "Hey, I want to use Oracle versus Microsoft SQL Server." So why blockchain? So I try to. It's a sort of a balancing act a little bit. Set up.
So can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. So when we started the conversation, you talked about Ethereum and Hyperledger as a framework, kind of a framework for setting up the blockchain. Is there anybody out there today that, because we're working on solutions that we can make blockchain ready, and then it's about enabling blockchain as it or if it emerges. Are there any backbones out there today that that currently are commonplace backbones that blockchain leverages, or do you start to see blockchain moving to these clearinghouse concepts where you've got these authenticators that clear transactions, and that kind of stuff? I'm just kind of curious on the backbone piece.
No, I mean, you're looking for ultimately, as a sensor guy, right? Yep. Like, you're looking for are there common APIs and data definitions that are managed and governed by anyone, anywhere? And generally the answer is no. But industry is going to have to start aligning somehow on that. Either we're going to align on a specific product provider, or we're going to rally as a consortium, or we're going to look to existing consortium groups to define that. Stuff.
So like we've done some work with Hyperledger Fabric, which is IBM's sort of bread and butter blockchain application. They've done some integration with like Watson IoT, that they've got some APIs built. But so you look at them as sort of the ones that have a full stack package of sort of AI, IoT, blockchain, and it's still very rudimentary. So we'll get there. My concern, and I think it's pretty well borne out, is that you're going to have the standards not necessarily set by X9 and these bodies that are professional standard setters. The standards are going to be set by which reaches commercialization first and which reaches scale first, which isn't necessarily going to provide you with the best solution. So it's kind of the VHS Betamax, right? Betamax was better, but VHS ultimately reached scale first.
So thanks for coming here again. One question I have is that when you're online and you're, on Reddit reading things like that, one thing you see a lot is, banks are going away in 5 years. We're not going to have banks anymore. And with David and Chris here, I just really wanted to get your thoughts on that, because I think that's kind of naive thinking right now. At least, I have a hardware wallet personally, and all the steps it takes to buy cryptocurrency, put it on the hardware wallet. I couldn't see my parents doing that, or anyone really doing that at this point. But maybe when the technology and the processes are much easier a couple years down the line, I just was wondering, what are your thoughts around that question?
No comment.
I'll say the hard stuff first, and then you can come in with the official Federal Reserve policy. It's a great question, and so I wear a work hat and I wear a personal hat. And my work hat is maybe 1% Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, just because it obviously has some applications from a philosophical perspective, if nothing else. And then outside of work, I probably spend 50 to 75% of my time reading about cryptocurrencies. So I think until or unless the world governments decide that the issuance of currency is no longer important to them, there will be a role for banks, or at the very least central banks. The Bitcoin started from this sort of anarcho-capitalist movement where we're just going to get rid of the financial services industry, banks, and we're going to sort of take away the government's power to print money. And printing money is something that governments take very, very, very seriously. It's how they influence everything that happens in the country. And they are not going to give that up easily. So until or unless there is a massive shift in people's mindset, and particularly government's mindset, on approaching these things, I don't see the financial services industry going away. Financial services performs a vital function for the government, and that is around mitigating the risks of money laundering for criminal organizations, mitigating the risks for terrorist financing. The financial services industry is the way in and the way out for all the capital. And that the government is not going to sort of let that go away easily. Philosophically, right, I can look at this and say, there's a lot of advantages to having digital currency be the way that we mediate transactions. I think it's very much more likely, and I'll say something that I'm sure that David won't say, I think it's very much more likely that in the next 5 to 10 years you're going to see major central banks begin to issue their digital currency, so fiat, dollar, euro representations of their currency that only exist in a digital format. The ones to keep an eye on for that would be like the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the Monetary Authority of Hong Kong. Those are the ones that are really on the leading edge of issuance of fiat currency on ledger or central bank issued digital currency. It would not surprise me in the next 5 to 10 years to see the Fed, the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada begin to follow suit.
Again, no comment on that. But that's a fantastic question, and we could probably spend hours talking about that. But you're talking a little bit about a scenario. So let's say there's some digital currency. Let's grab Bitcoin that takes over our world. If you think about the central banks, I'm not talking about the U.S. but anywhere, their ability. So what are the things that central banks do? Right, they inject capital into the markets, inject money into our system. You wouldn't have that ability to do that anymore. You're setting the interest rates between banks and the impact it has on the economy. Like that you wouldn't have control and impact over that. And what's fascinating to me about this question is, I feel like one of the big drivers why we have some of these digital currencies popping up came out of the financial crisis and sort of the trust that was lost against some of the financial institutions, some of the central banks, around the world. And and it really sort of built this interesting way to transfer money peer-to-peer without central authorities. And now it's sort of the other way. Now if you do go into that world, where is the trust, right? Do you have the trust and you have the backing and the insurance? And you see with Coinbase, and I don't know if anybody knows Coinbase, I keep bringing that up, but they're sort of the exchange of, if you're in the Bitcoin world, if you're going to take you're going to take money out of Bitcoin and get U.S. dollars out of it, you have to go through an exchange. Now the SEC is sort of plugged into that as well. But if you look at all of a sudden now they're starting to sell insurance. They're sort of becoming bank-like functions because of the things that are missing in the virtual currency world. So are we? Is our world going to go away? No, but is a wallet going to be really like a bank account and be owned by a bank? Maybe someday that's what it might look like. But it might be sort of two different worlds we live in. Who knows?
Nice. Thanks, Chad. So, Dave, I don't know what you recently said, but I don't know if you guys noticed the market was tanking in the last couple of
great.
hours.
Yeah, great. Interest rates.
So I don't know if that video feed is actually live or what.
Thank you for that. Yes.
But
my key card won't work this afternoon.
In order to try to get us kind of a little bit out of the financial services, which is an important use case, like I said, the question is really, Dave, for you. Supply chain is a big use case for blockchain, but my question is it really about the transparency and trust, disintermediation of trust, or is it more about efficiency? Because you made a perfect point earlier when you said that, yeah, it's great that somebody said that I'm shipping 20 pounds of something to you, but did they really ship 20 pounds, or is it just what the records say? So really the question is, when we have this boundary between physical and digital world, when you digitize your assets so that you can put them on the blockchain, is there any thought about what are some of the mechanisms that can be used and leveraged to ensure that people trust that transition?
Yeah, I think, so that's a huge question, and there are. So the answer is yes. But the use cases that people are exploring typically aren't grounded. Like that's a business-centric as opposed to customer-centric. And so like we tend to focus first on like what's the customer, what is the market willing to tolerate. So like a really good example in the supply chain is palm oil, where in half the world, sustainability. So if we can prove provenance and comprehensive sustainability, including things like we're not just not cutting down the rainforest, but we're also educating farmers and then sourcing from those farmers that we've educated and that they're like able to return that, and we segment that part of the supply chain through the milling process and once we get palm oil out to we can get that all the way through markets. One half of the world really cares about that and will pay for that type of solution. And like sustainability means a whole lot. And then like the other half of the consumer market like doesn't care at all. Like clear cut it and get me the cheapest palm oil you can possibly get me, right? And so then what we try to do is find like where the incentives are. This is the so what question, right? So and that really like turns it around. So like there's a customer centric like what is the market really asking for here in terms of traceability, provenance, et cetera? What are our customers up and down the supply chain really curious about and willing to pay for differentiation in? And then, like, where can we apply technology to solve those types of problems? And efficiency is part of that. Telling the story is part of that. Compliance, just driving better compliance and sustainability reporting is a big part of that. But there are a lot of different levers you can pull there, and really just identifying where in the market you're rewarded for doing so. Food safety is a huge thing. Like romaine lettuce this week was a big story. Cargill doesn't sell romaine, so I can safely talk about that. We're not in the romaine business since the incident. No, we're never in the romaine business. But even that, like fresh produce is very contrived. Like there's no transformation. Like you take something out of a field and it moves through a few distribution centers and then it gets out to someone else, right? Whereas you look at an animal or grain, things that get processed or reprocessed or refined, like those become much, much harder conversations to have. And for commodities like cocoa beans, there is a market for single source chocolate or single source coffee. I want to see the picture of the farmer who produced these cocoa beans, right? But like corn oil or like this can of like I always say, if your product depends on a QR code, like you're failing from the first start. Like I'm not going to beep my can of Coke to see the face of the corn farmer who grew the aspartame that went into it, or like that doesn't do much. So like, where is it ultimately pay off in the market? Or those are the levers we're looking at first and foremost. If that made sense, I don't know if that made sense.
Anyone else?
Maybe you do. This guy's looking at his barcode. I would be happy to introduce you to some corn farmers. That would be like. Aspartame? No, yeah. Cargill, that's good stuff. That's totally a tangent, though. Like corn syrup is like technically what it is. And then like the corn syrup industry tried to rebrand it as corn sugar. Yeah. And then so they put up like signs in our cafeteria like, enjoy your corn sugar. Like no one's going to call it that.
So my question is more so from the consumer level. As individuals, besides really just buying Bitcoin and getting really rich, are people even considering using it for their own personal use? And is that something that you consider as you're implementing as a part of the enterprise? Do you consider how that's going to affect the consumer? And how does the consumer utilizing blockchain themselves, how is that going to affect what you're implementing?
So let me take this, the first part of that answer, it's an extension of your question. Again, I think from a financial perspective, if you think about the trust in the financial system that we have today versus sort of the virtual unknown of the virtual currency world, tomorrow is virtual currency going to take over the world? I don't think so, because when I leave my house with my wallet and I go down to the grocery store to buy some corn sugar. Dave didn't even catch it. He's really fun. If I go down and buy something in the store, like I want to know when I leave my house and I get down to the store that dollar's worth $1. I don't want to get down to the store and open up my wallet and say, oh my God, no, it's worth 50 cents, right? Until there's that stability and that guarantee, which you can only get through our financial systems. Like I don't think it'll be a daily use, currency. I think the fact that you have a hardware wallet, that's pretty cool. I think there are some neat cases. I sold a car a couple months ago on Craigslist, and there's a box you can check if you're going to accept virtual currencies, and I checked that. I thought, well, I'm going to get all these illegal things, but nobody contacted me. So I think we're a little ways off. That's my first part of the question. I don't know if you guys want
Yeah.
to.
So Bitcoin has a sort of a theoretical limit of about 7 transactions per second. So you compare that to, say, Visa, which is in the realm of about 25,000 to 50,000 transactions per second. So as of today, if you wanted to go buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, you can do it, but it's going to cost you money, because the more transactions that are trying to go through the blockchain at any one time, you have to pay more for that transaction to happen. So I think until Bitcoin, and Ethereum too for that matter, figure out a way to increase their ability to process a number, more transactions in a set period of time, it's going to be very difficult for them to achieve any mass adoption. What's driving the price today is speculation, hype, and the hope that it can be more than what it is today based on some technical implementations that both of the networks are exploring right now. I think, second, I will say this as absolutely as I can, recognizing that I can't predict the future. Unless Bitcoin or Ethereum agree to remove what is effectively anonymity from the network, there's no way that it can play within the traditional financial services industry. So here's an example. In December 2016, Bitcoin was about $950. Say you move your money out of your bank account, $950 over to Coinbase, the wallet, and buy a Bitcoin for $950. So the bank sees $950 move out. A year later, Bitcoin was at about 19,500, right? And so you decide, okay, I'm going to exit this position in Bitcoin. So you sell it for 19,500, move your money back into your account. So the bank sees $950 or $1,000 go out from Coinbase, goes out to Coinbase, and they see $20,000 a year later come back in from Coinbase. The bank has no way to understand what happened to that money, right? Was it just a straight up buy sell Bitcoin transaction? Were you participating in human trafficking? Were you, all sorts of other unsavory activities? And that's what one of the bank's principal responsibilities is to watch for that sort of behavior. And so if that happens at massive scale, it's going to be very difficult for banks to justify what they're doing without constantly filing suspicious activity reports that might be indicative of money laundering. So it's just not something at scale that's going to work until there's additional safeguards in play.
Hey, trivia question. You heard us talk about fiat and non-fiat based digital currencies. Does anybody know what the word fiat means?
It's a car, right?
This guy probably knows. What is it?
Currency backed by government.
It is currency backed by government, but the word fiat itself is Latin for the word trust. So when you hear fiat based, you can think of dollar backed or some kind of asset backed trust.
Anyone else?
I don't need a mic. I can be loud. Just mining, what is it? Why can a currency be produced out of mining data? And then also, with the fact that the government can print money to inject into the economy, is there an unlimited amount of crypto that, is there just the sky's the limit for the amount of cryptocurrency that can
Depends. Varsha, how does it work in your platform?
Well, we have our hands off of anything to do with cryptocurrencies, so maybe you would be better answering the question.
So, anybody else jump in? So, is it unlimited? Like Chris alluded to earlier, like Bitcoin has a limit. There's a limited number of Bitcoin that can ever be produced. Mining is the process where, that is the way to both offload work onto the network as well as to inject new currency into that's how new currency is created in Bitcoin. You do this mining process. You get rewarded for basically solving a math problem, and you basically get Bitcoin for solving that math problem, which ties the whole network together. Bitcoin has a limit. Ethereum has a higher limit. Are there any infinite ones? Do you guys know of? I know the dollar's infinite. We can keep new dollars, but I don't know. I think a lot of them have intrinsic limits. Ethereum is way. The what?
The Fed is infinite.
The Fed is infinite, right? We just keep. This is another trivia. Do you know how we create currency? How we create money in the economy? We actually do that by. The Fed is the only organization that can do that. We do that by buying treasury bills. We buy T-bills. That's how we inject dollars into the economy. So in the digital currency version of that, the miners are the ones that are creating currency.
The theory behind it is that the miners are spending money, energy, to solve that math problem, and that the more the financial incentive is there, the more miners you're going to have trying to solve that math problem, which helps to secure the network based on the principle that in the long run, marginal revenue equals marginal cost, so that as long as there is sufficient economic incentive to mine, thus earning new Bitcoin, there will be more miners that are coming in to try to solve it. And then a new block is added every 10 minutes, and in order to ensure that a new block is added about every 10 minutes, the more mining horsepower there is, the more computer basically flops that are going through to try to solve that math problem, the math problem becomes more and more difficult.
And there are companies that literally have monster data centers, and they're called mining pools. And all you can go out and say, I'm going to go into a mining pool, and you can pay to sort of lease their hardware. And some of these are in the mountains of Afghanistan. There's one out, and they're mining Bitcoin. Like that's their sole purpose. They make money off of it.
At this point, I think it consumes as much energy as the nation of Denmark. And they reckon before the next 2 years it will consume as much energy as the United States, which doesn't feel sustainable, but that's just me.
Like you said, that's just to keep consensus, keep the heartbeat of the network, basically, right?
So that's why we talked before this discussion that blockchain will solve our greenhouse problem, but it'll use more electricity than it's probably worth. So.
So I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has.
I have one.
Yeah.
Where would you start the conversation, and what would you hope everybody would take back from what you've talked about so that they can start the conversation in their own companies? And maybe where do you see the most promise the earliest right now?
Tic-tac-toe.
Internally we frame it
Varsha, go ahead.
So I would say the first thing is you have to go beyond the hype and see whether you have a solid backing of an actual use case that you're trying to solve, right? Experimentation is good, but you have to have a critical problem that you're trying to solve to get into this technology.
Yeah, I feel like even the example I gave in the beginning, which now I'm thinking through it, a lot of the things we're doing, it's we as technologists doing things to sort of learn how the technology works. And again, I think about your business problems, as Varsha was saying. Are there, you think of the benefits, really understand the benefits of what blockchain can bring, and then look at your business problems and say, okay, what business problems, do I have that, perhaps this can be solved by?
And I would say, read things that allow you to form a narrative about how the technology can be applied. So I'm not a technologist, right? I can't code, but I'm fluent enough in it to be able to spin a good yarn to our technology people or to our business people, right? And they're the ones that you want to start having conversations with because they're going to be the consumers of it. The technology is the technology. It's just another database technology. But being able to tell a story, right, which I think is what you were alluding to earlier, being able to tell a story about the value of the tech and where it should be applied, I think is the single most important thing that you can do right now.
And I can tell you, Neil Kashkari, of the president of our Fed, would care less about blockchain. But if I said, we could, help the identity crisis in third world countries, like that would strike a chord with him. Mm-hmm. So it's really, again, back to that business case.
Great. Thank you. Let's give a little roll. Yeah, awesome. And thank you. Chad?
Yeah, hi, I'm Chad West, Director of Sales over at CoherentSolutions. Thank you. Only one clap? Thanks. Now, just piggybacking on the last question that Sarah asked, curious how many people have started a blockchain conversation at their organizations? Can I see a show of hands? 1, 2, 3. There's probably a couple more, I assume, I hope. So I've got 2 more poll questions. Have any of you started prototyping or building proof of concepts at all? Max has. Okay, that's 1. That's enough. So we at CoherentSolutions have started on a prototype using the Hyperledger platform. We're getting pretty excited about it. We're doing this. This has been great. I'd like to continue the conversation and show you our prototype. So my third poll is, who here would be interested in at least getting an invitation to see our demo? Everyone's got to raise their hand before I'm done.
Or you pay for lunch, right?
That's right. Okay, awesome, fantastic. Look for that invitation around Q2. And in the meantime, sales part, if you have a use case that you'd like to run by us to see if it is appropriate for blockchain, you can ask me. I'll definitely bring someone else in the room because I'll be likely to say yes, but we'll have a meeting and we'll give you some feedback. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.